Wheel bearing failure on a car is actually pretty common. Sometimes it's as simple as wheel bearing noise. Other times, it may seem like the wheel is actually falling off the car. Along with that, diagnosis of a bad wheel bearing can also be both easy and hard. This one here, that was super easy. It seemed like the wheel was about to fall off. On the other hand, sometimes it's not so obvious, like this 2018 Volkswagen Golf R, which has a bad rear wheel bearing. So in this video, we're gonna figure out which bearing is bad, and I'm gonna show you step by step on how to replace it. This one's all-wheel drive, so you can't just spin the wheel like that. When it comes to diagnosing a bad wheel bearing, there's 3 steps that I generally take. First is going to be a test drive. On the test drive, we're listening to see if we can tell where it's coming from, just driving in a straight line. Then what I do is I turn the wheel to the left and to the right, effectively loading up the suspension to see if the noise changes. When I veer the car to the left, that loads up the right side suspension. In general, when a wheel bearing is bad, the noise will get louder when you load up that side of the suspension. So veering left should make a failing right wheel bearing sound louder. Next, what I do is I get the car off the ground and move the wheels back and forth. This might be side to side, top to bottom, or spinning the wheel with it off the ground to listen and feel for any abnormalities. The third thing I'll do is spin the wheel, or in the case of an all-wheel drive car, let the car run in gear on the lift and use a screwdriver like a stethoscope to listen for a noisy bearing. In the case of this car, it initially did sound like it was coming from the rear. There was no play in the wheel back and forth or up and down, but when I rotate the wheel, it felt like maybe there was a flat spot in the bearing. Then with the car running up in the air, using a screwdriver as a stethoscope, I could hear that the right rear wheel bearing was making a ton of noise. Okay, I just gave you a bunch of ways to test wheel bearings, and I gotta tell you, sometimes even doing that, you don't find which bearing was bad, and you actually gotta take a bit of a gamble, or you might have 2 bad wheel bearings. I've ran into both of those things before. However, on this car, I am very confident with what I found that it is this wheel bearing that's bad. So let's go ahead and replace the right rear wheel bearing on a 2018 Volkswagen Golf R. What we're doing should also cover Mark 7 and Mark 8 Golf R. It's also worth noting that this is a sealed bearing, so we're gonna be able to do this job with some basic hand tools and some triple squares, which are just a little bit above the basic stuff you might have in your toolkit. And of course, I'll link up the bearing and the tools that you're gonna need down in the description. Okay, our first thing we're gonna do is we're going to either take the wheel off or take the center cap off of the wheel to get access to our axle bolt. If you have factory wheels and you can't get the wheel cap off, you might have to take the wheel off, pop the center cap off, and then reinstall the wheel. Now, if you have an impact, you can blast this bolt off. If you don't, lower the car till it just touches the ground, grab your 12.24mm socket, and crack it loose. Now you can take your wheel off. If you have a wheel hanger, you can install that. If your car has one, take that T30 out. Now we're going to take off the caliper and caliper carrier. I'm gonna leave it all together, which means we're going to remove these 2 triple squares right here with the number 14 triple square. I like to loosen the bottom, then loosen the top, then take the bolts out. Also, when you put that triple square in the bolt, make sure it's in all the way. If it's not in all the way, you round out this triple square, you're gonna make a bad day for yourself. You can see on my triple square the change in color. That's about how deep the triple square goes into the bolt. When you make that final loosen of the bolt, make sure you're supporting the caliper and carrier. Also, when you take the caliper and carrier off, don't let it just hang by the wires or the brake line. Now we can slide our rotor off. This exposes our wheel bearing. This is the piece that we're actually going to replace. It's all one piece, both the hub and the bearing in one. Now I've already loosened the bolt for the axles, but I'm gonna take that the rest of the way out. Before taking the bolt out though, I usually like to press on it like that. That's gonna push the axle out of the hub, so that gives us a bit more room. Now it's important to note, if you're doing the left rear, you need to be aware of the ride height sensor. We're doing the right bearing, so we don't have to worry about it, but if you're doing the left, make sure you pay attention to whether your car has a ride height sensor or not. If it does, you may wanna unbolt these bolts right here. Otherwise, you run the risk of breaking it, and that's like 400 bucks that you probably don't wanna have to spend. Now, I don't think this is gonna be a mandatory step of this job if you're doing it at home. However, to help you see what I'm doing a little easier, I'm gonna pull the dust shield off. That's just gonna open up a little bit more room. I'm gonna disconnect the wheel speed sensor connector and the DCC connector, and I'm just doing that to get these out of the way. Next up is going to be a very important step of supporting our knuckle. If we start unbolting stuff because of spring pressure, this is just gonna come smashing down, and you don't want that. Technically, by the repair manual, you are supposed to take the spring out first, but because this owner has this shield on there, I can't get the spring compressor in there, so we're not gonna do that. But what I am gonna do is I'm gonna support this with the screw jack. You use a floor jack if you don't have one of these, or if you're doing this on the ground, we're gonna loosen this bolt. Every one of these bolts we're taking out technically is one-time use. I'm gonna two-time use these and hope that we don't have any issues. There's one. I also like to put the nut back with the bolt, and when I set it on the ground, I'm gonna set it down the orientation that it was in the car, just to make sure you get it back where it came from. You know, I said two-time use this. He's got lowering springs, so I bet this is not the first time these have been out. When you're lowering this, be real careful that it doesn't all come flying down at you. But notice that popped right up. Then I'm gonna take this bolt out. That's gonna allow us to move this whole assembly to get the axle out of the way. There's that guy, that's a big boy. Shasha. Okay. This is not going as smooth as I had hoped. Struggle bus. Struggle bus. It's close. There we go. Huzzah. Now, according to the repair manual, you're supposed to completely remove this axle. However, I didn't really want to do that. So what I did instead was I took the two bolts out of the trailing arm that go to the knuckle. This one here with the shoulder is the one that goes on the top. This will allow us to have enough room to move the knuckle and get the axle out. The next thing we're gonna do is I'm gonna crank this up a little bit and I'm gonna run this bolt back in. That's gonna hold this assembly from flobbling all around on us so we can actually loosen and then retighten the bolts that hold the wheel bearing on. I also made sure to leave the shock out of that rear control arm so that it's not blocking the bolt. Pop this bolt like that. That's just gonna hold this a little bit so that I can loosen the bolts at the back. These are number 12 triple squares. These bolts are very shallow. You gotta be super careful and make sure that triple square is fully seated. If there's any debris or anything inside the head of that bolt, take the pick and clean it out. I'm telling you, if that triple square is not fully seated, you will round this out, and that makes for a super unfun time. Once those bolts are out, we can do that. Pop the wheel bearing right out. This car has 120-something thousand miles on it. Ooh, listen. Compared to the new one. Okay, here's our old wheel bearing. Here is our new one. A couple of really important things. This ring right here is part of the wheel speed sensor. What you don't want to do is set the wheel bearing down like that. That can damage that portion of the sensor. And you'll find out when you have an ABS light or a fault for the corner you just put a bearing in. So don't do that, always set it this way. Also, it's not recommended to grab the bearing like this. I guess it could cause damage to it. I'm not really sure, that's a repair manual thing. Here's our new one, it looks real fresh. Make sure this surface right here and this surface right here are clean. That way you don't drag any dirt into the knuckle. Before you install your new bearing, you want to clean any dirt or debris out of the port in the knuckle. Be mindful that this piece right here is your wheel speed sensor. You don't want to end up doinking that. As these cars mile up, or our Rust Belt cars, yours is probably not gonna look this nice and clean. Just keep in mind you want this to be as nice as possible and as clean as possible to put your new bearing in. Slip that bad boy right in. Once your bearing's in, you can start your bolts by hand. You do wanna make sure that the bearing is fully seated though. Don't use the bolts to drive it in. You can end up messing up the threads. Now I'm gonna take this bolt back out so I can drop the control arm down. We're gonna put our shock back in place too. Make sure when you're going in with your axle, you don't force it. You don't wanna wreck the splines on the axle. When it goes into the bearing, should slide right in with like almost no resistance. If you have resistance, take it back out, try it again, so you don't end up boogering it up. I normally start all this stuff by hand just to prevent any cross threading. Now for the final bolt, this one, be careful because you're actually going to be compressing the spring when you lift up on the control arm. So just be mindful of that. There we go. This is started. We can now lower this down. Remember, the bolts for the trailing arm are different. Be sure you get the one without the shoulder started on the bottom. Okay, now these two bolts that we took out, there is an important note. Again, all this hardware technically is one-time use. These two are supposed to be tightened without the suspension loaded. These are also the last two to get tightened. So you notice I tightened all the rest of the bolts with the screw jack lifting up on the suspension. These two, you don't want that. That's why I removed it. Make sure you do these last and make sure the suspension is not loaded up. Next, we're gonna put our axle bolt in. This is a new one. This baby gets torqued to a whole bunch of torques. It's like 200 Newton meters plus a half turn. So she's a tight old one. We're just gonna get that on there like that. We'll put our dust shield back on, put our wheel hanger on. It may be worth cleaning all that yuck off the rotor so that your rotor properly seats onto that new wheel bearing. Now we'll take our brakes, which I have zip tied, and get that just like that. We'll get our wiring just kind of set in place, and I'll plug that in after we tighten our brakes. Go ahead and get your caliper carrier bolts started. The torque spec for these is 90 Newton meters plus 90 degrees, assuming you're using new bolts. We're not using new bolts. I feel like if I started a band, it would be called one-time use hardware or something like that, with how much dang I say these things. Similar to how we did with the back of the brake, you may need to clean the wheel hub. Ours looks pretty good. We also have aftermarket wheels, so we have our hub-centric ring I gotta put on, which is that little guy right there. I'll awkwardly fumble with this wheel, just like that. There we go. Don't worry, we'll torque these babies when we get the car on the ground, because we got to torque our axle bolts still too. This is the point where you're wondering, hey, did he forget to plug those two connectors in? The answer would actually be yes, I did forget to plug them in at first. I got them plugged in after I started the car and had a bunch of warning lights on. So make sure you do better than I did and plug that in before you put the wheel on, not after. This is a tight guy. 200 Newton meters, which is about 147 pound-feet of torque. This is actually the easy part of this whole job too. The hard part is the half turn afterwards. I'm gonna get down on here, put a mark at noon. This is the struggle-saurus part. Ready? That was hard work, but we got it. We have to put our wheel cap on, then we drive it, make sure it's good. After you're done and you take the car on a test drive, make sure you do all the same things that you did on the initial test drive. You really want to try and get the car to make the noise that it had before so you know that you fixed it. Sounds so good now. This one feels really good, and most importantly, no more noise, so I would say, job well done. Now, you know, I couldn't leave it alone and not disassemble this bearing to see exactly what is wrong. If you look right here on the wheel hub, you can see this is all galled up on one side, and it looks pretty smooth on the other. When we look at the actual ball bearings, you can see this side looks pretty good. This is the inner side, but when I flip it to the side that faces the hub, look at how crusty this is right here. You can see that's all dark and discolored, and there's barely any grease in it, where this side looks pretty good. All right, that's a wrap. Questions or comments, drop them down below, and don't forget about those links. Also, if you want more Mark 7, 7.5 videos, I got a whole playlist for you, and we're just about to get started doing some pretty spicy stuff on my Mark 7.5, this yellow one that had some sadness, but it's going to have some unsadness real soon.